Sometimes, when world leaders meet, the spectacle is almost as telling as the script. First, Trump rolled out the red carpet for Putin in Alaska, a summit full of optics but no real breakthroughs yet. No ceasefire, no peace deal, just smiles and, of course, a shared limousine ride. Days later, Zelensky was ushered into the White House, a show of support, but again, no decisive outcome as yet. So, what conclusions are markets drawing? Defense has been such a hot theme this year, especially in Europe. How will markets respond to a peace deal? And even if peace is hopefully secured, will the structural case for Europe to keep bolstering its defenses remain intact? Welcome to the next big thing, Wisdom Trees podcast, where we talk about trends changing the world. I'm Mobeen Tahir, Director of Macroeconomics and Thematic Research at Wisdom Tree. And in this episode, once again, I'm putting my co-host in the hot seat, Chris Gannatti, Global Head of Research at Wisdom Tree, and we will unpack those shifting geopolitics, what they mean for Europe's defense industry, and of course, for investors looking to navigate all the noise that surrounds the topic right now. So, Chris, there's a lot happening on the geopolitical front. Of course, I mentioned the summits, the meetings between President Trump, President Putin, Zelensky. Let's just start right there. A lot of headlines, but of course, no substantive outcome as yet. But a lot of focus, a lot of expectations, some market reaction as well. How do you see all of these developments as someone who looks at it from the market lens like me? Is this something that affects the structural case for Europe and the defense theme, or are we just seeing more noise in the short term?
It's certainly a lot of noise. I remember listening to now President Trump at that point. It was candidate Trump, who was the Republican nominee. It was roughly a year ago, give or take. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast for a bit more than an hour. He did one of his campaign strategies was a few of these really long podcasts. And I don't know if the podcast was the first time he mentioned the famous statement that it was some variation of, if I were in the chair, meaning the chair behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, Putin would never have made the invasion. When I'm in the chair, we're gonna solve this, on day one, less than a day. We're gonna, have peace. I have a whole plan of how to do it. You can go back to the podcast. He certainly said something along those lines. And obviously, we sit here. It's August 21st, the day we're recording, and it has not been solved, and it was not something that could be done in a day or so. And you never know if he regrets making certain statements, or if it's all sort of an opening gambit that gets toward an interesting place in a negotiation. That if you didn't make all this noise and obfuscate what you might really be trying to do, maybe you don't get certain opportunities for certain outcomes. At the end of the day, it's interesting to watch, without question. The idea of maybe world leaders can get together, come up with something so that there isn't. I think the main goal here is there is no more fighting presently, and then a reasonable path to assume a lower chance of fighting in the future. And that's where you hear the idea of all the security guarantees and those parts of the discussion. As Mobeen, you clearly noted, there's not an exact, this is what is put to paper that we need people to sign. There's none of that. You don't know if and when the next, as we're doing this recording anyway, you don't know if and when the next meeting will occur. There's no dearth. Probably anyone listening can do a Google search or a ChatGPT, Perplexity, however we're searching these days for information, find no shortage of various things that note the non-traditional nature, the ignoring of previous historical norms, all these things that make it seem like that certain experts cannot believe that there was even a meeting in Alaska, or there was even a shared ride in the limousine. So there is still the partisanship and all of that. But I try to keep focused on the core, which is we have a nuclear power, Russia. They've done something. You wish they hadn't done it, but they did do it. It's now more than 3 years since they did make that invasion. And if we can get an end to the hostilities, it's very interesting. Now, talking about this topic this week, relating it to the market, I mean, Mobeen, as you point out, it's one of the hottest topics that we've been discussing for the better part of the last 8 months. And one of the reasons that it becomes such a hot topic, like a topic can be hot on its own for a day or two, but to be hot for 8 months in the investment world, usually what that also means is the performance. When you throw up a chart, you're seeing something going up and to the right, and you're seeing it go up and to the right at a faster, higher, steeper slope than benchmark indices, because you don't talk about something for 8 months that is giving you mediocre index like benchmark like returns. You talk about something that's really on fire, and there are certain names that you can look at: Rank out of Germany, Hensoldt, Saab out of Sweden, Rheinmetall, Indra, Rolls-Royce. If you pull up prior to this week the returns of a lot of those particular companies, the chart looks you wouldn't know. Are you looking at a high risk asset? Are you looking at something else? Because the steepness, the power of the positive return has been remarkable. Now, then you see this week, and there is a natural thing in markets where the stocks that give you an incredible return in a short period of time, there are people out there, all sorts of different investors, all sorts of sizes, institutions, retail, anything, that would basically naturally say, I made a trade, I made a lot more money than I was expecting in a shorter period than I was expecting. It's time to sell. And it's possible that they saw the Alaska meeting, or they saw certain other news, and they start selling some of these positions. And some of the names I mentioned, in a day or two or three, some of those stocks are down between 10 and 20%. So you sit there and you say, has anything really changed in terms of the need for Europe to adjust course? And the course that had been sitting there for about 30 years, it started really at the end of the Cold War, heading into the Clinton administration. For perspective, the Clinton administration started in 1992. 1992 to 2000 was the Bill Clinton presidency, followed up by the George W. Bush presidency from 2000 to 2008. And you sort of go into that era, and you'll see widely referenced the peace dividend, quote unquote, where it's basically this idea of, we all are in this thing that we call NATO, but with the end of the Cold War, there is this sort of implicit guarantee that, well, if something really happened, the U.S. would take care of it. And one of the things that happened, I think it was 90 or 91, but don't hold me to the exact date, but the world saw, and sometimes the way these conflicts unfold in the media is very telling, and it sort of creates further policy response. The world saw the Persian Gulf scenario, where you had Saddam Hussein invade Kuwait to get the natural resources, the oil. Kuwait had a lot of oil, one of the highest per capita nations, richest per capita nations in the world at that time. And essentially, they see almost something that looks like a video game playing out on CNN and BBC and the like, where you see the smart bombs hitting the targets. And it seemed like 24, 48 hours, some absurdly short period, you saw the technological supremacy of the United States on full display in the early 90s, quelling that issue in such a short period of time that everybody sees that and says, well, if there's ever an Article 5 issue, meaning one of the members of NATO gets attacked and we have to treat it like everyone's getting attacked, we just saw what the U.S. did to Saddam Hussein. If they have that type of technology, and they probably didn't even use all their best stuff, if they have that type of technology, we basically can just sit back and they're just going to take care of everything. There was that widespread attitude the U.S. would take care of everything. And that persisted not for a few years or a decade. That persisted for the better part of 30 years. And President Trump sort of upended the narrative. Trump term one, just again, for perspective, that was 2016 to 2020, which feels like forever ago. It's not that long ago, but feels like forever ago. And he started getting people thinking, is everyone paying their fair share? At that point, 2% of GDP. And the answer was a resounding no. And different countries were different distances away from that actual commitment. But he started getting people thinking. Then we had the Biden presidency 2020 to 2024, which was a more traditional, more do it by the book, pay attention to the widely established post-World War II norms. So you weren't really hearing as much about this. But to be fair, for anyone listening outside the United States, it is a very popular position. One of the things that gets attention, the general U.S. citizen is not necessarily thinking about the exact territories in Ukraine that are showing up on a map. The general U.S. person is not necessarily able to even picture exactly where Ukraine is on a map. But what they do absolutely understand, and it does get hammered, you see the message of $200 billion getting sent on an ongoing basis to Ukraine. Everybody clearly understands that in the context of debt and deficits and the DOGE and all of those discussions. And so the idea of spending money and making these issues, framing these issues from a monetary perspective, from a budget, from a wow, look at what we're spending in the US on all these external nations, sort of the us versus them mentality that President Trump has brought in. That is a very big thing, gets an enormous amount of attention. And it's probably one of the few parts of the narrative that really sticks. Now, President Trump term two here, which we're about 7 months in, give or take. Now we're really seeing the rubber meet the road. And we're really seeing European governments. I was reading a paper called Rearm 2030, where it was indicating that by some measures over the coming 4 years, Europe is going to free up and be able to spend roughly 800 billion. We've seen it's been widely reported the German constitution was amended so that more spending, and they have 100 billion coming, and it's widely thought that they're going to have even more. I mean, 100 billion spent one time is not going to do the job. I know, Mobeen, we talk a lot about cybersecurity and how there's always attackers and defenders. No matter what happens in Ukraine, and hopefully, I think all of us hope that we can put an end to the overt kinetic hostilities. But even if we get to the end of those overt kinetic hostilities, you still need a deterrence factor. You still need Russia or any other actor, state actor or non-state actor, to know that the European nations can credibly protect themselves. And that's something that requires ongoing effort, ongoing investment. A lot of what's published is not, we're going to spend some money and it's going to be all over by 2026, 7, 8. A lot of what's written is the earliest stuff is you see the goal of 2030. Now, there's some stuff where you see the goal of 2035 and even beyond that. And so the key thing to have in mind is what you've seen in markets is certain great companies with huge order backlogs, lots of government contracts dropping by, depending on the company, depending on the time frame, 5, 10, 15, even 20% in a short period. In our opinion, at WisdomTree, for a longer term focused investor, if you were concerned about valuation, concerned about missing the run up, this is the kind of thing where you might be thinking about seeing those dips as opportunity. As what's unlikely to happen is you go from where we sit here in 2025 to 2030 and all the stocks just go up in a straight line. That's extremely, extremely unlikely, even if the governments and the nations of Europe are continuing to spend and continuing to focus on this defense priority.
Excellent overview, Chris, and I like how you mentioned uh, the paper coming out of Europe, the 2030, and I think that's a good reminder that this is not just about a cyclical upswing in the defense sector. There's a structural story which remains intact. And over the last few months, as we've been speaking with investors on this topic, I think the question came up repeatedly. Certainly here in Europe, I can speak on behalf of our conversations that have happened with investors here. What happens if there is peace in Ukraine? Does the story end, or is the story still intact? And I think what you've articulated here is a perfect summation of the picture, that yes, there will be perhaps what I believe you and our colleague Sam Rhines called a healthy breather in a very strong bull market for defense stocks, maybe giving investors an opportunity to go into the theme if they've been waiting to go in and they've been concerned about rising valuations. Maybe this gives them an entry point. But certainly the structural story with Europe thinking long term and these budgets increasing and the 2030 and beyond timelines being mentioned, these are certainly things in the long run. I also like how you mentioned companies like Rank and Hensoldt and Indra. I was speaking with Rank the other day, and one thing that came up during the conversation was how even Rank now I pick up the company Rank because yes, people have come to know some of the giants in this space, but for some of the younger companies in this space, Rank stands out not just for its spectacular market performance, but the strong fundamentals that back it. We spoke about how they've got a record order backlog, their book to bill ratio, and that's a metric we've been talking a lot about when we're covering this topic. The order book relative to how much revenue is coming in, and of course, if that ratio is rising, it means more orders are coming in, and the revenue will follow. So the book divided by the bill ratio was 1.5 as of Q2 for the company Rank. So real orders are coming in. So it's not just a case that markets are in the mode of animal spirits and the share price just keeps rising because there's um, irrational exuberance out there. There's real business and real orders coming in which are backing the excitement in markets. So I like that you mentioned that. But speaking of company stories, Chris, of course, we spoke with Rheinmetall a few weeks ago, and I do invite our audience to check out that episode. We had Rheinmetall on the show, of course, a defense giant in Europe, and also a company that has had a slight pullback in recent days, just like the rest of the sector. Something that stood out to me in their second quarter earnings was that they missed earnings estimates, which of course were very optimistic, but they missed estimates, and management said that the shortfall was primarily due to delays in certain large defense contract deliveries and a temporary slowdown in order intake. And it was a good reminder that defense contracts are long term in nature, and it's not like the orders come in and you realize your revenue there and then. These are multi-year contracts. You get an order, you manufacture the stuff, and revenue follows. So of course they're still seeing record orders. We on the podcast spoke about the 60 billion plus euros of order backlog, which could potentially hit 100 billion uh, in um, in the coming months by the end of the year. That's what we were told on the show. And of course, it will benefit as Germany looks to make progress towards that 3.5% defense spending target, going to going to defense by as early as 2029. So let's start there. Let's get your take on how you see the stars aligning for a company like Rheinmetall. I know you wrote about it following our conversation there. What do you make of the dynamics that the company is presenting?
Well, Mobeen, you had one of the best words, and I'm not sure if you picked it up off of the Rheinmetall website or if you just coined it, but I want to make sure we say it again here. Technology,
I picked it from the website.
because
I don't want to take credit.
because admittedly, as someone sitting in the U.S. prior to this year, I'll be honest, and I think a lot of our U.S. listeners, we say the word Rheinmetall, people may not have heard of it prior to this year. It just wasn't widely discussed. It wasn't a company that a U.S. investor would naturally come across. But you then see this year, and one of the interesting things is there are certain company names where they're in the private space these days, and just the branding around them, the aura, the halo effect is unbelievable. Anduril is one of those companies, and I remember sending to you, Mobeen, a headline a few months ago now, where it was basically noting a partnership between Anduril and Rheinmetall. The concept being we're going to have certain software and drones and progress along those lines. So the value of that is remarkable, because when I'm speaking to people in the US and I can point to, there's this company, it's really big and it does interesting things, and they have the tanks and the ammunition and they're increasing capacity, and all of that stuff is great. But if I can then put the stamp that, and they're also partnered with Anduril and Palmer Luckey, and a company that has the imprimatur of excitement all over it amongst the U.S. audience, that is even stronger and better. Now, some of the intriguing things to sort of take away, both thinking of the earnings report as well as some of the stuff that was discussed in the overall company strategy. The tricky thing about some of the earnings reports, and you see it with a number of these firms, in that you're not dealing with like in the world in which we live, we're used to, I have the desire for a certain thing, I click a link, a button on a website, usually Amazon these days if you're a Prime member, and within the hour or two it just shows up. So there's almost no delay. I want it, I'm going to get it. Governments, even the German government, it was widely discussed. They're amending the constitution. They're coming up with $100 billion fund. They're appropriating the $100 billion in different tranches that ultimately occur over a number of years. The tricky thing is to not immediately think, when you see the headline, as we all do, of the 100 billion euros, that immediately that money is just, it's there, it's spent, it's gone. We're still in, I believe, the appropriations process, where there's still further administrative things being done to get those initial tranches of funds out the door. It's not like there's this giant risk that it doesn't happen. It's not that at all. It's just, we in the investment world have a quarterly cycle where on a certain date, you almost have to freeze the books, freeze the accounting statements, and say, whatever's happened up to this day, we are putting in the package. The board's going to see it, and ultimately all the shareholders, and it's going to go on our investor relations website, and the CEO is going to talk about it. And then anything that happens after that date, it's just going to get picked up in the next quarter. So frequently what can happen is these government appropriations and contracts are not always attuned to the quarterly sort of shareholder cycle. And so sometimes a contract or a certain revenue recognition or a certain amount of money, deal, whatever the case may be, could fall in the next quarter by a few days even. And what that could mean, especially if it's a large contract, is it could mean the difference between amazing earnings on that quarterly cycle and earnings that leave you scratching your head thinking, what the heck happened? Mobeen, you're talking about a 63 billion order backlog. Like, did they just forget what they're doing? Did some other thing happen? And similarly, I mean, NVIDIA had this exact issue last year. They announce their new chips in March at their GTC conference. The Blackwell was announced, and then as it was getting closer and closer to starting deliveries, there was a small issue. Now, I guess with Nvidia, nothing is small. It's a 4 trillion market cap company, but suddenly it was, it's going to be a few weeks to possibly a month or so before we'll be able to deliver those first Blackwell chips, because there was a certain issue with the packaging, and it was ultimately fixed without too much fanfare. But it does affect when certain revenues can and can't be recognized. And a given quarter can go from looking absolutely lights out and unbelievable from an analyst perspective to looking average, neutral, possibly even bad. And additionally, what can happen with these defense companies, I think in the case of Thales, which is a French firm, another one that we focus on a good bit, is you sit there and in 1 year, you might have a series of 500 billion contracts going into the pipeline. But then you have to remember, okay, when I'm looking at the same quarter in the next year, there's no reason to necessarily expect another equivalent series of multiple 500 billion capacities to recognize either new orders or revenue or whatever the case may be. And so the year over year comparison after a lot of these orders come in, it may not necessarily look amazing, but at the same time, you have to always remember what this backlog is telling you, what 100 billion backlog is telling you at Rheinmetall is you've basically got something on the order of 7 years of sales already booked. And the company, if all goes well, and it's not a guarantee, you don't want to view this as like a risk-free, but if all goes well, for the next 7 years, you know roughly what the sales could be because they're already booked. And the company, what's the company doing? Well, they're actually making the planes, the tanks, the weapons. It's not something where you just click a button and Amazon delivers it to you within the hour or within a day or within a week. Some of these things take multiple months, if not more than a year to build. And one of the very interesting things I think that Rheinmetall is doing, I don't think they're the only one doing this, but one of the big stories last year was also the fact, and I think this comes back a lot to China, which we've talked a lot about Ukraine as one of the hot geopolitical flashpoints, but China is another, for different reasons, geopolitical flashpoint. And one of the things that's happened, and it's very noticeable in Germany, is you have the firms like Xiaomi and BYD making what the world thinks are amazing electric vehicles. And what that means is suddenly Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, Benz, all these other companies that used to be selling a lot more, say into China and other places, now all of a sudden have a new source of competition. But those factories that were used to make some of those cars are still there. The people who work in those factories are still capable. And I have seen discussions, articles, reports that Rheinmetall sees that as a potentially very productive resource. Volkswagen plants, or at least some of them in particular. And, you sit there and you say, if Volkswagen vehicles are not what is desired, needed, selling into the marketplace, but these defense-oriented things are, maybe it makes sense to retool some of that industrial productive capacity, shift it over, and now we're taking advantage of Germany's productive industrial base in ways that if you weren't seeing this, you wouldn't be able to do. You would just have, obviously, a factory sitting there saying, we wish the economy was better. We wish more people wanted Volkswagen cars. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And there's not much that can be done. So it's a very interesting opportunity to take Europe's industrial know-how, Germany's industrial know-how, and reposition it into something that is in line with where the world seems to want to go on these topics.
I have not, Chris, yet come across a better word that encapsulates this idea between technology and defense, tanknology. I think that is a single word that that can capture the whole story, that technology and defense, these things are intersecting, and they're intersecting very quickly. And that's one of the things we had the privilege of speaking with Rheinmetall about, and getting more color on the topic. You mentioned their partnership with Anduril. That, I think this is an interesting broader subject to explore. Tech often gets developed for the battlefield before it becomes a mainstream, broader civilian use technology. If my knowledge serves me well here, even the GPS, I believe, was initially developed for the US Army before Google came out with Google Maps. Radars were, of course,
Semiconductors.
semiconductors. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
And even SUVs, which I know, Chris, you and I drive today, I believe they started out
I
as
think
Jeeps
we
for
have
the
the
military.
same car. We might have the same car, Mobeen, electric Audi, admittedly.
Oh, there you go, there you go. And it it all became civil technology before they were being used as Jeeps for the military. But one story that stood out to me on this intersection between defense innovation and just general tech innovation was the partnership between Saab and Helsing. Now, Saab, of course, another defense giant, Swedish defense giant, and they make a lot of things. They make submarines, they make fighter jets. And one story from July that stood out was a partnership between a German startup defense technology company Helsing and Saab. So what they did was they allowed a Saab Gripen E fighter, a fighter jet, while there was a pilot flying the fighter jet in a couple of exercises, training exercises. The Helsing software took control of the plane. So for a moment, it was being flown for some time by the Helsing autonomous software. And later, Helsing, they came out and said that the best human fighter pilots, you can expect them to accrue 5,000 flight hours during their entire careers, 5,000 in their entire careers. And they claimed that the Helsing software took 72 hours to gain a million hours of experience. So in just 72 hours of running, it gained a million hours of experience, when the best fighter pilot will only gain experience in their entire over their entire lifetime of 5,000 hours. So very, very strong statement. And of course, they said that we can very quickly go to superhuman performance, and we might even have uncrewed fighter jets in Europe in the next few years. Now, of course, we've been talking about this, and Chris, you and I, we've talked about this on the show as well. That the topic of autonomy, we've spoken about this in the context of cars. We've spoken about this in the context of even flying taxis with Joby Aviation. How easy it is, or how easy is it or not to achieve autonomy? But I know this is becoming an increasing topic. Maybe the whole um, autonomous machines, planes, cars, and so forth is something that the defense companies might have a breakthrough on, and car companies will follow suit. But I know this topic is becoming very relevant in the US. We have Anduril, we have Shield AI, other startups which are approaching the defense subject from a tech mindset, like a tech startup, rather than an established manufacturing player, manufacturing defense equipment and so forth. So, how do you see this new emerging dynamic? That there's this intersection happening, and new types of businesses are emerging, certainly in the US, but also in Europe. And maybe this is an opportunity for Europe to play catch up with US, now that there is such a focus to develop and build its own tech champions for the future.
Well, it comes back, Moby, and I think to and there was an interesting thing that happened, and it reminds me of how earlier we were talking about the world in the early '90s saw a certain sort of new type of kinetic battle against Iraq when they invaded Kuwait. It wasn't as though there was a long drawn out thing. It was basically the U.S. hadn't shown certain capabilities for some time. They had the opportunity to do so, and the conflict was over in a matter of days, much faster than anyone possibly would have realized. And additionally, the media coverage made it crystal clear what was going on. And so I was at an event in Washington, D.C. Eric Schmidt, formerly the CEO of Google, has this thing, the Special Competitive Studies Project. And it was an event where it was in the beginning of June of this year, right around the time, maybe a few days after Ukraine had done a particularly successful surprise attack, mostly using the capabilities that it has, which is sort of the idea of fighting a kinetic war with a larger number of individually cheaper things. Drones are most often used, but sort of small explosive, improvised explosive device. These kind of things that are very different from if you think of the contrast when we were talking a few months after that about Iran and certain missiles that only the U.S. has that might cost $50 million per missile or bomb that could penetrate basically entire mountains because these nuclear facilities are built under mountains. You sort of have this interesting contrast. So because this event was happening right after a big success in this sort of drone autonomous type of kinetic warfare, a lot of the discussions when you would hear people asking questions, and it wasn't only tech firms that were there, it was also many officials from the US government, some senators and representatives. So it was a wide cross section. And there were actually, in some of the discussions that I got to take part in, some people from the Department of Defense were almost like reminding the groups that there's kind of not just a one size fits all, or if there is, we haven't found it yet. Because, you know, what worked well in that particular case in Ukraine is well and good, and the way in which the Ukraine conflict is unfolding is well and good, but you may not be able to just take a cookie cutter and say, let's use that. And we saw you could not use that exact template and apply it without any adjustment to Iran. You needed to do something different in Iran. If there ever is something in Taiwan or in Asia, you're probably going to need to do something different again. It's thought that you'd be dealing with a lot more water-based things. And so it was interesting to hear the Department of Defense officials sort of pushing back and trying to say, look, the autonomy and the electronic side is important, and we're doing it. So it's not like they're not doing it. But they're careful to say it doesn't mean that we can just forget about all this other stuff that has proved to be, for the better part of the last 30 years, post-Cold War era, a great source of deterrence. You look to what seems to be happening on the European side now. And Mobeen, I know we've talked a lot about cybersecurity. The civilian side of cybersecurity is a little bit different, but it's instructive because, and sometimes it's overlapping. You know, whether it's the NotPetya or various things that have happened. NotPetya was a particularly big one, widely thought to originate in Russia. It was kind of an attack that was focused on Ukraine and basically shutting down Ukraine from an electronics perspective. But it sort of spread throughout certain shipping companies like Maersk and affected pretty much the whole world. It's one of the most pernicious software cybersecurity attacks that's ever happened. And one of the very interesting things about the Ukraine conflict is that you didn't have. It was widely thought. I was sitting in London in February, March 2022 when this was all getting started. And I was thinking, and I was reading a lot of articles about the idea that, okay, Russia is going to just do a bunch of things from a cybersecurity perspective. But we have the benefit of speaking to cybersecurity experts in multiple different domains. The way they described it is, if something is a complete surprise, then there's almost nothing you could do. So like NotPetya was obviously a complete surprise, caught everyone unaware, and we saw 10 billion plus in damages around the world. You are setting up an actual Russian invasion that the satellite footage and feeds were beaming out to the entire world for at least days, possibly weeks leading up. So it wasn't a surprise attack. It was sort of well telegraphed in the sense that people knew they weren't just gathering troops on the border for no reason at all. One of the things that was interesting is you saw big companies like Microsoft and others providing their cybersecurity defensive services to the front lines for basically no cost to help try to secure the electronic side of Ukraine. And what you didn't hear, it wasn't like there was no effect. There was certainly an effect. But what you didn't hear was a similarly huge cyber issue, which goes to show if countries and state actors are prepared and they're defending actively, it's a lot harder for the threat actors that are trying to disrupt a network or disrupt a power plant or other critical services. It's a lot harder for them to have that negative effect. So there is sort of an interesting intersection. But Mobeen, I think you're exactly right in the sense that a lot of that spending, when you basically say, what is it that the countries that are getting towards, whether it's 2.5, 3.5, in some cases like Poland, possibly closer to even 5% of GDP, what is it that they're spending the money on? I think in the past, it would have been planes, it would have been tanks, it would have been other vehicles, it would have been things more similar to like what you would think of as a cruise missile, where it's a missile that costs probably between 1 and 5 million, depending on the range and the tech specs and all the rest. Today, you're getting a lot more spending on electronic warfare. And electronic warfare could be radars, jammers, other types of systems where there's an interesting sort of field of research where they're trying to develop energy weapons. If people are familiar with the movies, when a nuclear bomb goes off and there's the electromagnetic pulse that I've fortunately never seen one of these things in action, but it goes out and it bricks all the laptops, TVs, cars, anything that runs on electronics. It becomes a brick. It becomes unusable. And so the idea is you have these sort of focused energy weapons where if there's a drone swarm coming in, you point the focused energy at the drones and they just fall out of the sky. It's a different, instead of shooting, kinetic projectiles at drones, which we know maybe not the easiest thing to do. This energy could just, again, take the drones immediately out of the sky, potentially. So it's an interesting cat and mouse game that's playing out. But when you're seeing companies, whether it's Rank, it's Thales, and some of these others that focus more on electronics. BAE is another one. BAE does many things, not just electronics, but this is one of the things they do. This is another thing to have in mind about why, even if there's peace in Ukraine, you cannot say, okay, we're good. The second you say, okay, we're good, whether you're a business needing to protect from a cybersecurity perspective or whether you're a country needing to protect your citizens, the threat actors, sometimes other countries, sometimes just smaller groups, non-state actors, whatever it might be, these guys are never stopping. And so you can never fully stop, and you need to consistently invest in having the best technology because that's what the enemy is doing.
Chris, I was once involved in a project where the photographer actually used a drone camera to take some footage, and perhaps the best footage that I've seen of myself being captured. And of course, it was his excellent skills, but we used a drone in that shoot. And the reason why I mention it is because, of course, as we've been talking about this defense theme and the war in Ukraine, and a lot of people who've been following the developments there, they've developed this appreciation that on the battlefield, like you were sharing the example of Ukraine's use of this technology, maybe on the battlefield, lessons learned from Ukraine, this is the future of uh, of the technologies that will be relevant on the battlefield. And in appreciation of that, they've come to know that companies like Leonardo, for example, have a very strong presence with this technology. Now, I was looking at their website, and we haven't spoken to Leonardo on this show yet. We would love to have them here, but of course, I was looking at their website, and some of the areas of technology, if you go into their areas, the technology areas that they focus on, it's an astonishing list. So they mention I think the first thing they mention is AI. So they don't mention
Mhm.
any defense
Yep.
thing. The first thing
Yep.
is AI. They mention communication networks. They mention cybersecurity. All topics that we've been following in other contexts, not in the context of defense, but as tech trends. They mention materials, of course, because they have to build these devices and stuff. Electronics, autonomous technologies, of course, they're making autonomous drones as well, so they mention that, which again could have interesting applications elsewhere. They even mention quantum technologies, which is an interesting new area. Software, naturally, because all of these things, if they're running on autonomous systems, there's a software driving them, and the list goes on. So what stood out to me when I was looking at that list was that, just imagine, this company has a lot of relevance on the battlefield, but with all the breakthroughs that it will inevitably have on any of these frontiers, AI, autonomous systems, cybersecurity, maybe even quantum developments. uh, we're already using drones to shoot people like me who might want to use that footage and for making films and all sorts of applications. But there will be applications for all of these technologies, which Leonardo is feeling a sense of urgency on to develop for the battlefield. But maybe there will be relevance for these companies beyond the battlefield as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's exactly right. Leonardo is fascinating. Flipping through their investor presentations, one of the things that stands out to me is how acquisitive they are. I think there was a particular page that said they had proposed something on the order of 24 acquisitions so far, and it might have only been a period of 6 months or so, the first half of 2025, and very few of them actually are coming to fruition. But just seeing that sort of method of management where you just recognize, look, we're here to grow, we're here to acquire, we're here to be involved across all these different technologies. One of the pages as well that stuck out to me, beyond just the acquisitive nature of the company and the partnerships that they have, for instance, with Bakyar, the Turkish drone maker, and this idea of you're incorporating the best of breed in a particular area, and Bakyar is very, very good at making those unmanned flying vehicles, and you combine it with Leonardo's expertise, and you have something really special. But there is a lot of, I mean, one of the things that gets discussed a lot these days in the U.S. Is the Golden Dome. Now in Israel, I guess it's called the Iron Dome. Now in Israel, it's like actually deployed. It has an impact when Iranian missiles are being fired towards Israel. There is a system that gets into gear, does shoot most, if not all, of the missiles out of the sky, and relative to the damage that could be incurred because of this system, it's vastly less impactful, less damaging to Israel than you would otherwise think if every missile was hitting the ground. So it's an impressive system, and obviously President Trump never wanted to miss a branding opportunity. You've got the idea of Golden Dome, doing something similar in the U.S. The reason I mention it in the context of Leonardo is one of the pages in their presentation sort of mapped out a system, and the system included satellites, and it was illustrating the concept of you might detect a particular launch of a missile or other projectile, and it's interesting to sort of think through the steps, because what you really want to do is, if it's going towards, say, a major city, you want to be able to neutralize the threat. But all the things that need to happen technologically such that you can accurately take that missile or other projectile out of the sky again and again, as many times as you need to. And thinking about the sort of intersection of sort of these low Earth orbiting satellites, which is another technology. I know SpaceX gets a lot of attention for that. There are other companies as well in Europe that do a lot with sort of these low Earth orbiting constellations of satellites. And it looks like that's another area where Leonardo is sort of seeing activity. And I think, to me, that's a great example of a technology where it's almost like you're building an infrastructure. The infrastructure historically has been cell phone towers and other means of sort of transmitting data. But more and more what we see today is the infrastructure could be satellites in low Earth orbit. And some of those satellites might be allowing us to watch our Netflix or Amazon Prime Video or whatever it might be, use the internet faster, use the internet on planes. That's another topic that gets a lot of attention. So you have the civilian use. And then some of those satellites, I'm sure, are collecting information, surveillance, communications, data for military purposes. And Leonardo is certainly not the only company doing this, but it is clear that the world is trying to progress toward a standard where if a sizable missile is launched from anywhere, you can detect it and you can start to analyze if it's something that should be neutralized. And then they want to get to very clearly a point where if it needs to be neutralized, they can actually credibly do it again and again. I think where we are today in the US is there's a chance we can neutralize. I read the book by Annie Jacobson about a nuclear attack, and she was going through how there's 44 different interceptor missiles, at least at the time of the writing. I'm not sure. I don't have classified information, so I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but it was an interesting description. And I do know the U.S. is very, very large. So if you think of Israel from a land perspective is not anywhere near as large as the U.S. And so if you're trying to create an Iron Dome-like system for the United States, I wouldn't say it's impossible. I would just say you've got a lot different considerations and a lot more area to cover than you might have in the case of Israel.
So, Chris, as we approach the final bits of our conversation, one topic I do want to get your take on is cybersecurity. It's come up in our conversation today, and it's something that is increasingly being talked about in the context of defense. Of course, the new NATO defense spending targets, the 5% number, is of course made up of 3.5 going to core defense and 1.5 generally going to cybersecurity. So increasingly, cybersecurity is being seen through that geopolitical lens, that lens of defense spending. And through this new lens, how do you see a renewed interest in the theme in general? Of course, we've been talking about cybersecurity as something that sits in sits maybe in on the agenda of IT departments and corporates, but now it's coming on to the agenda of national security for government. So, how does that change the discussion for cybersecurity as a theme going forward?
There's what you were alluding to there, Mobeen, reminded me of a talk that I listened to. It was a podcast on the Sean Ryan show. That is a huge podcast, so some listeners are certainly familiar. The guest in that instance for about 3 hours was Alexander Wang, if that name sounds familiar. This is I think they're reorganizing it a bit, but for the last few weeks anyway, this was the head of Meta's new superintelligence effort. He had founded Scale AI, the company that Meta took a 49% stake in. He was describing, among other things, I mean, in a 3-hour discussion, you cover a lot, but one of the things he was describing was sort of this offense-defense type scenario that could very well be playing out, because one of the key rivalries that we see, cybersecurity is almost like a consequence or a second order. The first order, and it appears very clear because we see all the money getting spent on chips and data centers and large language models, and it's global news. Like when China was having trouble training the DeepSeek model, I know we talked about this, Mobeen, over the past week or two. China having trouble training the DeepSeek model on Huawei chips and needing to go back to NVIDIA chips. Now, in one version of the world, that's just, an operational footnote. They're trying to train a model. They try something. It doesn't work. They try something else. But it is instead framed as existential geopolitical theater where it's like, oh, China's chips, not good enough, can't do the training. NVIDIA stepping into the breach. Jensen Huang got the special license to sell the H20. It's unbelievable how much attention something that is really just the operation of running a large language model and developing a large language model currently gets. Now, why is it that this is the case? Well, Alexander Wang goes through the whole discussion of how if you're thinking of, and you could think of it system to system, where you're basically saying, okay, across the United States and across China, there's power plants, there's water treatment facilities, there's all kinds of things that make human life as we know it possible and functional. And you can deploy quote unquote AI agents, which are the topic of the day. And if your AI agents are stronger and better than another adversary's AI agents, your AI agents, similar to like a battlefield, only it's happening in cyberspace, your AI agents are going to win. That country and all the people are going to sit in the dark. And how long are they going to want to sit in the dark before they say to the leadership, we're going to vote for someone else? So ultimately, you have this artificial intelligence scenario. Quantum computing is related. It's not as big a topic as AI, but it's related because as people are sitting here saying, why is it important when you hear David Sachs, the current czar of AI and crypto in the Trump White House, coming out and framing it as a US versus China, and we need to stay competitive and ultimately be better than China from an AI perspective? Why would he be saying that? He wouldn't be saying that just so we get better Netflix programming, we get a few better content recommendations, companies like Meta just make some more money on advertising. This does not rise to something that affects the geopolitical stakes. What rises and affects the geopolitical stakes is they're sort of thinking ahead and saying, if AI agents can take action virtually across networks, you want to have the strongest ones, because if everyone knows yours are stronger than theirs, what does it function as? We talked about deterrence. We can bring it full circle. We talked about deterrence in the kinetic sphere at the beginning of our discussion today, and how deterrence is necessary whether or not the Ukraine conflict is ongoing. In the AI sphere, deterrence, knowing that a country possesses a certain capability, is also important. Cybersecurity sort of functions as something where currently firms like Palo Alto and CyberArk and Checkpoint, they're using AI to help defend. But it almost feels like, as you watch the space, the advancement of AI is sort of first, and then the cybersecurity is sort of immediately second, sort of stepping in to try to ensure that all this cutting edge AI, we know it's going to fall into some nefarious actors' hands, and we're going to be ready to sort of clean up and protect against the threat actors that are certainly, and already, there was an article yesterday in The Economist on the website detailing some of this, how threat actors are currently using AI. What does this mean? Better text messages that are more convincing, voicemails that are more convincing, emails, phishing attacks. Everything is appearing more and more and more convincing. Why is that? AI.
So AI is sort of the first thing, and in a way, cyber seems like the immediate second, stepping in to sort of protect against all this new AI capability.
Chris, we live in the age of clickbait headlines, and I am not surprised that when Nvidia and China and Huawei and semiconductor chips are involved, we see sensational news pieces. So it's interesting that you bring that up. But of course, defense, AI, cybersecurity, technology, all very interesting topics and so much to discuss. But we'll keep that discussion going in future episodes. That's all we have time for today. So before we close, I do need to state the following. To clarify, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Next Big Thing. If you want to hear more from us, please do subscribe on whichever platform you're using, and do take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. You can of course follow us on LinkedIn or X, and if you want to learn more about megatrends, please visit Wisdom Tree's website. Join us again for another interesting topic next time, and we'll see you then.